Hi, I'm Lorraine, and this is the story of how losing control of my own life, on paper at least, led me to rediscover the quiet strength no one could take away. They said I was unwell, signed papers behind closed doors, and spent my trust fund like I was already gone. But what broke me wasn't the money. It was realizing the man I once called my husband had turned kindness into currency. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like your voice was erased behind a smile? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family betrayal you won't forget. They said I was unwell, but the only sickness in my life was the betrayal of the man I trusted most. I remember the smell of cinnamon toast warming in the toaster oven, the soft notes of cello rising from the classical station on the kitchen radio, and the way the October light filtered through the curtains, sharp but gentle, like a memory trying not to fade. I sat at the breakfast nook in my mother's old cardigan, the sleeves a little stretched but still warm, and took my first sip of coffee. Joel used to say I brewed it too strong. These days, I took comfort in the bitterness. Ever since Joel started attending those finance dinners without me, I knew something was shifting. The excuses were subtle, too loud, too crowded. You don't enjoy those kinds of things anyway. And for a while, I believed him. I had no reason not to. Until this morning. The envelope was waiting in the mailbox, tucked between a grocery flyer and the latest issue of Garden and Hearth. It was thin and crisp, legal stationery. I unfolded the letter slowly, afraid it might crumble under the weight of its contents. Joel had petitioned to become the sole custodian of my trust fund, and the court approved it. I stared at the page, my hand trembling. That fund had been set up by my first husband, Charles, before he passed. He wanted to make sure I'd never be left dependent on anyone again. Security with dignity, he'd called it. Joel knew that. He'd promised to honor that. I dialed the attorney's office, fingers stiff. A cheery receptionist answered and told me that Mr. Landis no longer represented me. Joel had updated the account. Before I could think of what to do next, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. "Morning, Miss Lorraine," Mr. Alvarez called, holding a small jar wrapped in a checkered towel. "Brought you some of that spiced apple jam." I met him at the porch. His plaid flannel was buttoned to the neck, and his hands, though worn from years of carpentry, were gentle as he placed the jar in mine. "The trees are throwing out gold this week," he said, glancing around. "Almost like they know something's changing." We talked about the new families on the block, and how the old bakery was now a yoga studio. He handed me a small wooden carving, a hummingbird, said he made it from leftover cedar. Just felt like it belonged to someone who still looks up. His kindness felt like an anchor. When I came back inside, I noticed a second envelope tucked beneath the first. Thicker. My breath caught as I read. Joel had already withdrawn $28,000. For educational purposes, it said. A tuition payment for his niece, Alyssa. A school I hadn't even heard of. I realized then, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan, and I had been written out. People think silence means agreement, but sometimes silence is just the pause before the storm. Joel used to say I was too sensitive, too tired, too forgetful. Every conversation that made him uncomfortable would end the same way. "You're too tired to deal with this right now, Lorraine." And for a while, I let that phrase shut me down. But lately, I'd begun to realize just how loud silence could be, when you're the only one left in it. I sat at my dining room table that morning, poring over old bank statements I'd stashed in a dusty file box in the hallway closet. I didn't understand all the language. God knows they write these things to confuse you. but I knew enough to recognize patterns. Deposits that didn't align, withdrawals that seemed arbitrary, expenses I never authorized. When the afternoon light shifted across the windowsill, I bundled up and walked to the library. The leaves outside were crisp and loud beneath my shoes, the sidewalks still lined with hay bales and scarecrow displays from Halloween. Inside, it was quiet in the best way. A soft rustle of pages, the occasional squeak of a chair. I didn't know what exactly I was looking for, but tucked between articles on retirement fraud and estate planning was a name I hadn't seen in years: Catherine Moreno. The newsletter announced her return to Hopewell, offering pro bono legal aid for elder financial abuse. I read her name twice, then once more for good measure. Catherine. I remembered the way her nose crinkled when she concentrated on math problems at my kitchen table 20 years ago. Her mother had worked long shifts then. I'd offered help just once, and somehow it turned into a whole school year of after-dinner tutoring. The next morning, I found myself walking into Daisy's Spoon, the downtown diner where time stood still. Warm cider steamed in glass mugs, and the windows were fogged with stories. Daisy waved me toward a booth, her lipstick still the same bright coral it had been when she and Charles used to chat about the Phillies. I had just started my apple pie when Catherine stepped in. Her scarf was knitted in soft blues and grays, fraying slightly at the ends. "Miss Lorraine?" she asked, uncertain but smiling. "Just Lorraine now," I said, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't good to see a familiar face. We talked. About the town, about her work, about her mother. And then she leaned in, voice low. "I pulled a few things already. Lorraine, Joel submitted a notarized letter 6 months ago. It states you're mentally unfit to manage your affairs." The fork slipped from my hand, clinking against the plate. I hadn't just lost my money. I'd lost my name in the eyes of the law. Trust is like old wood. It creaks before it breaks. I was standing in the kitchen when I heard Joel's car pull into the driveway. He hadn't called ahead. Not that he ever did. The early frost still clung to the grass, silvering the edges of the lawn, and the Thanksgiving banner from 2 years ago fluttered weakly from the porch railing. I didn't bother changing out of Charles's old cardigan. It was warm, familiar, and I didn't want to look polished for Joel. Not today. He walked in like he still lived there, brushing past me with that same whiff of cologne and entitlement. "Just checking in," he said, casually tossing his keys on the entryway table. "You've been quiet lately." I looked him straight in the eye. "Did you use my trust to pay for Alyssa's tuition?" He blinked, then gave a tired smile. "Lorraine, you weren't well last winter. You don't remember things clearly." There it was again. The same condescension dressed up as concern. "I remember enough," I said, voice steady. "I remember my husband setting up that trust so no one could touch it. Not even you." He scoffed, opening the fridge like this was his weekend home. "You're making something out of nothing. The tuition was necessary. Family helps family." "And what am I?" I asked. He turned, irritation flickering across his face. "You're causing trouble. Keep this up and people will start wondering if you're really stable enough to live alone." That was all I needed to hear. I didn't cry, didn't shout. I simply let him walk out, watched from the window as he drove away like nothing had happened. 10 minutes later, Mr. Alvarez knocked softly at my door, a knit cap tugged low over his ears, and a folded piece of paper in his hand. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop," he said, "but your windows aren't what they used to be." I took the note without a word. He hummed something slow and smooth, Sinatra maybe, as he turned to leave. Inside the paper, in neat handwriting, he'd written, "I remember that episode. You were grieving Charles. Not confused. I'll stand by you if you need. I finally saw it. Joel wasn't my guardian. He was my thief in a tailored suit. Sometimes justice doesn't start with lawyers. It starts with someone brave enough to knock on your door. I remembered Mr. Alvarez's voice as clearly as if he were beside me. "You're not alone in this street, Lorraine." And for the first time in a long while, I had begun to believe it. Snow drifted softly onto the courthouse steps in Trenton as we made our way inside. Catherine walked beside me, coat buttoned high, her presence like an anchor in the wind. Mr. Alvarez trailed behind, wearing his best church coat, freshly brushed. His hands were calloused but steady, gripping a manila envelope with his written statement inside. I'd baked ginger cookies the night before, the same recipe I used to make with Charles during the holidays. I packed them into a tin and carried them like a charm, something to hold on to. Catherine smiled when I offered one in the waiting room. Mr. Alvarez took two and slipped one into his coat pocket, for later. Inside the courtroom, my knees felt untrustworthy. But Catherine's voice was calm as she presented the motion to freeze the trust fund's activity. Mr. Alvarez's statement was read next, describing in simple, unwavering detail how I'd been lucid, thoughtful, and fully capable the day Joel claimed I was confused. Then came my turn. I spoke of the months after Charles passed, the sleepless nights, the empty dinners, the hormone shifts that rattled me but didn't break me. Joel had taken those quiet vulnerabilities and spun them into something damning. My voice trembled, but I didn't look away from the judge. Joel's attorney filed a response by email just before lunch. Cold, dismissive. He called my actions unfortunate and warned I was risking public embarrassment for the family. I folded the page in half and tucked it into my purse, unreadable to anyone else. But then the judge leaned forward. "A temporary injunction is granted. We'll conduct a full review of the trust's activity over the past 12 months. Outside, the cold hit sharper than before, but I felt stronger somehow. As we stepped down the courthouse stairs, Catherine leaned toward me and whispered, "We may need to subpoena Alyssa's school. That tuition trail might unravel everything. A good lie is like a snowball. Keep rolling, and eventually it buries everything." Catherine had warned me early on. Follow the money, and the truth will follow you. And now, with the fireplace crackling beside me and a pine-scented candle flickering on the mantel, I sat wrapped in a blanket, watching the storm of truth begin to unfold. Stacks of statements lined my coffee table, but it was Catherine doing the heavy lifting. She sat cross-legged on the rug, highlighter in hand, her brow furrowed. "Lorraine," she said quietly, "this account here, it's a hotel in Cape May, 4 nights, spa services. But you were here with Mr. Alvarez that whole week." I nodded slowly. "Joel said it was a resort he booked for my recovery last spring, but I never went. I didn't even pack a bag." Catherine's fingers skimmed across another document. "And look, here. Charges for Alyssa's tuition. Every invoice sent directly to Joel's address, not yours. This one's for music lessons. This one, tennis equipment, all filed under your care expenses." It was surreal. Joel's voice echoed in my memory, telling me not to worry about the paperwork, that he was handling things. And I had believed him, because I wanted to. Because for so long, he made me feel like I needed him. My eyes drifted to the photo album lying open on the table. Charles in his favorite blue sweater, squinting in the spring sun. I reached out and touched the edge of the page. "I hope I'm doing this right," I whispered. Catherine looked up at me. "You are." She placed a folder in front of me. Inside was a formal petition to reclaim full control of the trust. The legal language was dense, but its weight wasn't lost on me. It accused Joel of financial abuse, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. My hand hovered over the signature line. My chest felt tight, as if I were about to cross a line I'd spent decades avoiding. Once I do this, there's no going back. Catherine didn't flinch. That's the point. It took losing everything for me to remember who I'd always been. Joel once told me, "You'd never survive on your own." He was wrong. And tonight, under the soft twinkle of string lights at the Hopewell Community Center, surrounded by voices raised in laughter and holiday carols drifting in from the porch, I could feel just how wrong he'd been. The legal envelope had arrived that morning. It wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of my future. My trust was mine again. Joel's countersuit had been rejected. Catherine said the judge called it absurd. I didn't feel triumphant, just still. Like standing in snow just after it's fallen. I brought cranberry cobbler to the potluck, Charles's old recipe scribbled on an index card, stained and curled at the edges. Daisy greeted me at the door with a cider mug and a wink. "You look 10 years younger," she said. "That lipstick suits you." I smiled and stepped inside. The warmth hit me first, then the chorus of neighbors. Mr. Alvarez was wearing his best suspenders, humming along to the music. Catherine waved from across the room, arm in arm with her mother, and a kind-looking woman I guessed was her partner. Later, I stepped outside for air and found a small envelope tucked in my coat pocket. It was a card, hand-addressed in slightly shaky script. "You helped my girl dream bigger." Catherine's mother. I pressed it to my heart. When I returned inside, Mr. Alvarez tugged my hand. "Dance with me, Lorraine," he grinned. "It's Christmas." And I did. Just one song. Just enough to laugh without thinking. Just enough to feel like the parts of me I thought were lost had never left. Before the night ended, Catherine pulled me aside, her voice soft. "I've been thinking. I want to offer you something. A role, really. Part-time. Helping some of our elder clients go through their estate paperwork. Spotting things." I blinked. "You want me to?" "Be you," she said. "Kind, sharp, and looking out for the ones who need it." As midnight neared, I stepped onto the snowy sidewalk, mittened hands in my coat pockets. The stars were faint, but the quiet was full. I lost a fortune, but I found something far richer. That winter, I didn't just win back a trust fund. I reclaimed the quiet dignity of knowing who I am and who I've always been beneath the noise. What surprised me most wasn't the legal victory, but the gentle ways kindness came back around, from a neighbor's wooden trinket to a young woman's grateful note. Lies may travel fast, but it's truth, steady and unassuming, that stays. When we choose not to judge by appearances, we make space for grace to unfold in unexpected places. If this story touched you, perhaps consider who in your life might be standing in silence, waiting to be seen, not as weak, but as quietly strong.